Welcome to the Draw Your Life edition of Catcher in the Rye. Chances are you've heard of it before but don't really know what it's about, so here's the abridged edition. Catcher takes place in the middle of winter around Christmas time in early 1950s New York. All 214 pages of the book take place in just 3 days. The main character and narrator of the book is named Holden Caulfield. I will be drawing him in blue to keep him different from my other stick figures. There are two Holdens involved in this story. There is the Holden the story is happening to, and the Holden telling the story. The Holden telling the story is 17 and recounting the events that happened to him a year ago. He is now hospitalized due to a case of tuberculosis. Holden throughout the story can be called cynical and bitter. He tries to connect with people several times in the story, but it never works, so he resorts to calling them a phony. His biggest fear is growing up and facing the adult world. He also wears a red hunting cap often as a sort of protective blanket. Holden is also a really big liar and smokes a lot, which leads to his declining health in the future. There are other important characters throughout the story. Phoebe Caulfield, Holden's younger sister, has bright red hair. She is young, innocent, and smart. Holden loves her. Everything she does, Holden thinks, that killed me. He says that about a lot of people, particularly children who still have their innocence. There is also Allie, Holden's younger brother. He has bright red hair too. Prior to the story, he died due to leukemia. Holden still has trouble getting over his death because he is one of the only people Holden genuinely loves. He calls Allie the nicest person he knows and often uses him as a person to compare other people to. There is one other person Holden often talks about in the past tense, and her name is Jane Gallagher. Jane is a person Holden sort of had a thing with, but it was never sexual. The most they've ever done was hold hands, play checkers, and sports. It was a very innocent kind of love. Then there's Mr. Antolini. I don't know if he actually had glasses, but let's pretend he does for identification's sake. He was Holden's old English teacher at one of his older schools. He is one of the only grown-ups that Holden actually trusts. Later in the story, Mr. Antolini gives Holden some very important advice. Holden interacts with several different people throughout the story, but none of them are too terribly important or take too much backstory. I'll just explain who they are as I draw. The story starts out with Holden standing all alone on this hill at his current school, Pensy Prep, while everyone else was at the football game. He just got kicked out of Pensy and lost all the foils for the fencing team on the subway as they were going to a tournament, so he's been ostracized by his peers. He pays his social studies teacher, Mr. Spencer, a visit before he has to leave. Mr. Spencer tells Holden that life is a game, and like all games, you have to play by the rules. Holden thinks to himself that it's only a game for hotshots, otherwise you can't really play by the rules. Eventually, Holden gets uncomfortable and lies to leave Spencer's house. Back at his dorm, Holden is reading a book and puts on his red hunting cap that he bought while in New York. His neighbor named Ackley comes in to bother him. Ackley is kind of annoying and lousy and sort of dirty. He points to Holden's hat and comments that it's a deer hunting hat, to which Holden replies that it's his people hunting hat and he hunts people in it. All of a sudden, Holden's roommate Stradlater, I guess, comes in. He's a big hotshot on this campus. He asks Holden to do his composition, despite the fact that he knows Holden is flunking out of school. Holden agrees and asks Stradlater who his date is for that night. He tells him that it's someone who he says he knows Holden, Jane Gallagher or something or other. Holden reacts quite strongly, badgering him with questions about Jane. He thinks about going down to say hello, but doesn't in the end. Later that evening, Holden writes Stradlater's composition for him. He writes about this baseball glove that Allie used to have with poems written on them with green ink. As he writes, he reminisces about good times with Allie before he died and during his death. Later, when Stradlater comes back, he gets upset because Holden wrote about a glove instead of a room like he told him to. To make things short, they got into a fight because Holden thinks Stradlater did stuff with Jane, so he packs up his bags and heads for the city a few days earlier before his break was supposed to start. The first thing he does when he gets to the city is go into a booth to call someone. He thinks of all these people he could call: Phoebe, his older brother D.B., Jane, a girl he used to date named Sally, and even an old classmate named Luce, but in the end he doesn't call anyone and gets to the Edmond Hotel 20 minutes later. At the Edmond, Holden observes a few people across the hotel with their windows open. One of them is a man in a dress, and in the other window is a couple spitting water at each other. Holden wonders about sex and why such crummy sexual acts like those can be fun. Throughout the rest of the night, he tries to connect with other people, but they all fail to properly listen to him. When he gets back to the hotel, the elevator man, Maurice, offers him a prostitute for a night, which Holden agrees to buying. The problem is that he is still a virgin and doesn't really know what he's doing. The prostitute, Sunny, later comes by to Holden's room, but Holden doesn't really feel like having sex. He tries to get her to talk, but Sunny only came to do her job. He tells her that he's not in the mood, but he'll pay her the $5 anyway. Apparently, it's supposed to be $10, but Holden only pays her the $5 he was told to pay. Sunny leaves, and Holden smokes almost a whole pack of cigarettes before sleeping. Day 2. The next morning, Holden wakes up to Sunny and Maurice pounding at the door. Sunny proceeds to take the extra $5 Holden refused to pay, but Holden starts to cry in frustration. Maurice then punches him, making it the second fight Holden has gotten into in less than 24 hours. So what do you do when you've just gotten out of a fight? Make a date, naturally. He calls up Sally Hayes, the girl he used to date, to go watch a play around too. It's only noon when he leaves the hotel, so he goes off to find Phoebe in places she normally is. A bunch of kids at the skating rink tell him that she's probably at the Museum of Natural History. Holden thinks of the museum fondly, thinking about the Indian displays they have there. He likes them the most because nothing in it would change. Everything in it is like time has stopped and it is always the same. The only thing that would change is you, the observer. In the end, he doesn't actually go to the museum, but it is still a very important addition to the book. Anyways, he goes on that date with Sally Hayes, and he has a sort of lousy time of it because everything they do feels phony to him, but Sally thinks it's all grand. Later, they're just sitting around talking when Holden tells her that they should just run away and live in the woods somewhere away from everything. Sally is reluctant and wants to change the subject, saying that they're just kids and they still need to go to college and get a job first. Of course, Holden doesn't like that idea very much, and the date ends because he accidentally calls her a pain in the ass out loud. He then calls up Luce, an old classmate from his old school, and tries to make a connection with him, but that doesn't end up too well. So Holden stays at the bar and gets completely wasted before going home to pay a visit to Phoebe. Luckily, when Holden comes by, his parents are gone. Phoebe soon figures out that Holden got kicked out and asks him why he flunked out of school all the time. Holden tells her that he hated it too much, but Phoebe truthfully tells him that he hates everything. She asks him if he actually likes anything, and he tells her that he likes Allie, but of course, Allie is dead. She then asks him if he would like to be anything. He tells her of this fantasy he has of this giant rye field full of children playing around and having fun. He'd be the only big person around there, and what he'd do all day was to stop them from falling off this cliff at the end of the rye field, and that was what he would do all day. Upon hearing this, Phoebe simply replies, "Daddy will kill you." He takes a moment to call Mr. Antolini to tell him that he got kicked out, even though it's the middle of the night, but Mr. Antolini simply invites him over. When he gets back, he asks Phoebe to lend him some money. She gives him all of his Christmas money and insists that he keeps it, which makes him cry. He gives her his red hunting cap in exchange. He goes to Mr. Antolini's later, and there Antolini imparts on him some wisdom. He tells Holden that he is on for a dreadful fall that happens to men who are looking for something they thought their environments couldn't provide, so they gave up looking before they really found anything. He tells Holden that he has to start looking for something that he wants to do, and the minute that he does, he has to start applying himself to his studies, because it will help him figure out what kind of brain Holden has. Most importantly, Antolini tells him that he is not alone. Unfortunately, Holden was really out of it during this great piece of literature, so he missed out most of his speech and went to sleep. Holden wakes up later to find that Mr. Antolini is sort of petting his hair. He gets really freaked out and gets out of there as quickly as he could. He tells Antolini that he would be back. He sleeps at the train station that night instead. Day 3. The next morning, Holden wakes up terribly ill. He wonders if he should have gone back, but he couldn't stop thinking about this time a classmate of his named James Castle jumped out of a window to get away from some chump bullies who were harassing him. He was dead when he hit the ground. Only one person was noble enough to approach James and to carry him off, and that was Mr. Antolini. Holden kept thinking that maybe Antolini wasn't that bad of a guy, but it was too late now to go back. The rest of the day really takes its toll on Holden. He was half crazy for most of it. Every time he walks off a curb and crosses the street, he would feel like he was falling off, and he'd pray to Allie not to let him fall. He decides that he couldn't wait any longer and he had to leave. He leaves a note for Phoebe at school telling him that he needed to meet her. When she came to meet him, she shows up with a suitcase begging him to take her with her. Holden refuses and she gets upset. To make up for it, Holden takes her to the zoo. There's a carousel ride there that Phoebe wants to go on. Holden insists that she goes on while he keeps an eye on her. As Phoebe rides, she and every other kid tries to reach for this golden ring at the edge of the carousel that wins a free ride. Holden is afraid that she'll fall, but doesn't say anything to her about it. He decides that he had to let her grab onto it on his own, even if it does mean she falls off. When the ride ends, she comes back to give Holden his red hunting cap back. He tells her that he'll really come back home afterwards to tell their parents what happened. She goes back for another ride, and as he watches, he begins to cry and it starts to rain. But even though he's crying, he's smiling wide and has never felt happier than that moment. The last chapter is a sort of afterword with Holden in the hospital telling the reader how he's feeling. The book ends with him saying, "Don't ever tell anyone anything. If you do, you end up missing everybody."